Precolonial Black Africa by Cheikh Anta Diop. Chapter 2: Social-Political Evolution of the Ancient City. Social classes. The facts hereafter related are essentially taken from the ancient city by Faustin de Coulanges, as Grenelle remarks in his Les Religions Etrusques et Romaines, the Etruscan and Roman religions. Faustin de Coulanges' work remains the authority. At most, perhaps, might one reverse the order of the factors and, contrarily to what he said, explain the religious ideological superstructure by the economic living conditions. But even on this point, it must be recognized that his thought is extremely subtle. For some developments, he clearly seems to give precedence to the living conditions. Originally, there were two classes in Greco-Roman society: Athens, Eupatridae and Thetis; Sparta, equals and inferiors; Rome, patricians and plebeians. The Eupatridae. This first class is that of the haves. From the very beginning, property had a divine character, and only members of this class could possess the land in the sacred sense of the term. They alone, having ancestors, could have a domestic cult and a god. Without one had no political, judicial, or religious personality, and was thus impure, a plebeian. They alone knew the sacred rites, the prayers which for a long time had remained unwritten and were transmitted orally from father to son. Superstition and conservatism were inherent in them. They alone had an interest in maintaining the order established by their ancestors. If a priest introduced into the cult the slightest innovation, he was punished with death. Thus, it is not this class that was responsible for the progressive profanation of religion and the body of traditional beliefs, a profanation inseparable from what we have come to call Greek secular and rational thought. This was the work of the plebs. The owning class alone was patriotic, since only it has a patria, i.e., freedom of the city, while the plebs, without hearth or home, were restricted to the outside or the low parts of the cities, like the untouchables of India. Patriotism, so characteristic of Greco-Roman antiquity, is explained by the fact that society had not allowed for the foreigner, who thereby became enemy number one, without rights, who might be killed with impunity, and whose very eyes made the holy objects impure. He was punished with death if he touched a tomb or entered a sacred place. He could protect his life only by voluntarily becoming the slave of a citizen of the city. Hence, the class of clients. One can understand why men would defend to the last drop of their blood their city, outside of which they were vile, impure beings, untouchables, worthy at best of slavery. Thus, patriotism sprang from the very structure of society. At the start, it did not reflect a sentiment of purely national pride, as was the case in Egypt. Religious egotism, the gods were first and foremost domestic property, was an obstacle to the existence of a national territory more extensive than the city. Houses might not even touch one another, the connecting wall being a sacrilege in antiquity. Even in death, families were not commingled. The boundaries of field were sacred, the terminus gods. Primogeniture, which prevailed, produced among the Eupatridae the unprivileged and discontented class of cadets, or younger sons. They would in the end revolt in various cities in order to abolish primogeniture and paternal authority. The plebs. The lowest class, the plebs, was made up of all those whose hearths had gone out, fatherless children or bastards, one-time clients who now felt freer among the plebs. These could possess no land, married without sacred rites, in other words, profanely, had no sacred prayers, no religion. This is why they were the ones to trample upon tradition and liberate society from its ultra-conservative changelessness, which might otherwise have survived up to our time. In their alienation, without any compensation whatsoever, as against the golden rule of African societies, is where we may look for the deeper causes of the transformations and revolutions of the society of antiquity. When they had become the numerically predominant element of the people, the different phases of these revolutions will now be described. Priest kings. At first, there existed confusion between priesthood and civil power. The king of the city was at the same time priest, magistrate, and military chief. But kingship was never hereditary in Rome. Kings did not need military force to command obedience. They had neither armies, nor finances, nor police. The confusion of religious and political authority did not end with royalty. The magistrate of the republic was also a priest. He was designated by right, that is, by the drawing of lots in Athens. Thus, the people had the impression of receiving their magistrates from the gods who had caused them to be so designated. They did not seek the most courageous one, nor the one with the greatest military aptitude, or best suited to be chief of state, to invest with power. Rather, the man best loved of the gods. All of domestic and political life was dominated by almost unimaginable superstition. A sneeze could cause an undertaking to be stopped. The Senate might meet to make the gravest decisions concerning the security of the city, yet disperse at once when a sign of evil omen appeared. Acts performed with imperfect rites were worthless. As Fustel de Coulanges points out, only at the time of Cicero did people begin not to live their religion, but use it as a political expedient. It was useful to the government, but by then religion was already dead in the people's souls. The city-state. The Aryans, as long as they were relatively isolated in their northern cradle, never had the ability to conceive of a political, judicial, and social state organization extending beyond the limits of the city. The notion of state as a territory comprising several cities, or that of empire without question, came to them from the southern world, and in particular from the example of Egypt. Two facts we can easily understand. First, that this religion, peculiar to each city, must have established the city in a very strong and almost unchangeable manner. It is, indeed, marvelous how long this social organization lasted, in spite of all its faults and all its chances of ruin. Second, that the effect of this religion during long ages must have been to render it impossible to establish any other social form than the city. Every city, even by the requirements of its religion, was independent. It was necessary that each should have its particular code, since each had its own religion, and the law flowed from the religion. Each was required to have its sovereign tribunal, and there could be no judicial tribunal superior to that of the city. Each had its religious festivals and its calendar. The months and the year could not be the same in two cities, as the series of religious acts was different. Each had its own money, which at first was marked with its religious emblem. Each had its weights and measures. It was not admitted that there could be anything common between two cities. The line of demarcation was so profound that one hardly imagined marriage possible between the inhabitants of two different cities. Such a union always appeared strange and was long considered illegal. The legislation of Rome and that of Athens were visibly averse to admitting it. Nearly everywhere, children born of such a marriage were confounded with bastards and deprived of the rights of citizens. In ancient times, there was something more impassable than mountains between two neighboring cities. There were the series of sacred bounds, the difference of worship, and the hatred of the gods toward the foreigner. For this reason, the ancients were never able to establish or even to conceive of any other social organization than the city. Neither the Greeks, nor the Latins, nor even the Romans, for a very long time, ever had a thought that several cities might be united and live on an equal footing under the same government. There might indeed be an alliance or a temporary association in view of some advantage to be gained or some danger to be repelled, but there was never a complete union, for religion made of every city a body which could never be joined to another. Isolation was the law of the city. Under these conditions, the annexation of a city or a neighboring territory was unthinkable. One could not govern a conquered city because one was a foreigner in the eyes of its gods. One might massacre the population or deport it in its entirety to be sold. One pillaged towns but always returned home. There could be no question of settling conquered population on one's own territory and giving them residency, as Merneptah, a pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, and other pharaohs of Egypt had done with Aryan peoples each time they conquered them. Colonization rather had a religious character. The younger branches, without inheritance, lighted a torch in the city hearth so as to found another on virgin soil. Thus were founded by Athenian families the dozen towns of Ionia in which for a long time they preserved the priesthood and political power from father to son. Athens was the mother city to these 12 towns, which were its colonies. As can be seen, the bond was purely religious, and Athens did not claim in any way to exercise the least political control over the life of these cities. Nevertheless, because of economic necessities, confederations were finally formed to group cities together in a very loose bond. Such were, in particular, the commercial federations of Delos, Thermopylae, Caloria, and Delphi. However, according to Fustel de Coulanges, these associations were for a long time of purely religious significance, and it was only under Philip of Macedon that the Amphictyons, as they were called, began to be concerned with political affairs. Individualism. The individual was totally subordinate to the city. The dictatorship of the city was absolute on people's consciences. Once its power became established, the city-state became responsible for the rearing of the children in the place of the father of the family. It even regulated clothing, the wearing of beards by men, the adornment of women, and went so far as to dictate the sentiments that one should show. Sparta had just suffered a defeat at Leuctra, and many of its citizens had perished. On the receipt of this news, the relatives of the dead had to show themselves in public with gay countenances. The mother, who learned that her son had escaped and that she should see him again, appeared afflicted and wept. Another, who knew that she should never again see her son, appeared joyous and went around to the temple to thank the gods. What, then, was the power of the state that could thus order the reversal of the natural sentiments and be obeyed? We perceive here one of the causes of Western individualism as opposed to African collectivism. It has often been spoken about without minutely examining how it originated. So, let us inspect the facts available to our analysis. The families of different citizens constituting the city were separate cells, so independent that it was sacrilege for the houses to touch one another. These feelings of independence going back to life on the steeps. But each individual, each family head, each citizen was directly riveted to the dictatorial state by a bond of bronze. The day when this gave way, we would progressively see individuals attempting once again to become absolutely separate, for they had not learned to develop a communal civil life. In contrast, in Africa, the power of the state, although centralized from Egypt to the rest of black Africa, never subjugated the consciousness of its citizens in so strong a way. The pharaoh, considered by Moray to be the most powerful moral figure that ever existed, never dreamed of controlling the sentiments or the dress of his people. The individual always felt dependent upon the state and, socially speaking, upon his peers within community life. In Africa, there always existed a reciprocal invasion of consciences and individual liberties. In other words, each one felt that he had material and moral rights upon the personalities of others, and that they reciprocally had rights on him. This held throughout all political regimes. Even today, on a superficial level, the African may display a spirit of independence toward the community, but he is hardly likely to grasp the gap which separates the Western individual from the group. Aristocratic Revolution. Turning back to the political regimes of the city-states and following their development, one finds that their legitimacy was questioned as early as the 7th century BC. The coincidence of the priesthood with political power created a grave problem. The aristocracy formed by the Eupatridae found it to its advantage to disassociate the two factors, leaving in the hands of the king the symbolic ritual and the priesthood, while retaining for itself the political power. A revolution therefore had to break out, a first revolution of only a political but no social character. The kings wished to be powerful, and the patres preferred that they should not be. A struggle then commenced in all the cities between the aristocracy and the kings. Everywhere the issue of the struggle was the same. Royalty was vanquished, but we must not forget that this primitive royalty was sacred. The king was the man who pronounced the prayers, who offered the sacrifice, who had, in fine, by hereditary right, the power to call down upon the city the protection of the gods. Men could not think, therefore, of doing away with the king. One was necessary to their religion. One was necessary to the safety of the city. Plutarch writes, as the kings displayed pride and rigor in their commands, the greater part of the Greeks took away their power, and left them only the care of religion. What was then seen was a curious phenomenon. The kings, kept in place by religion, trampled it as much as they could, for it was the very thing that gave strength to the Eupatridae, the aristocracy. The latter derived all their power from the ancestral religious tradition. The kings then called upon the secular plebeian majority, who were not part of the population, which included only citizens and the clients. This was what was done by the first 7 kings of Rome. Servius, through a series of laws, improved the lot of the plebs, giving them conquered lands, which they might own in fact if not by ritual. The victory of the Eupatridae was consecrated by the reform of Lycurgus. Lycurgus had for a moment the power to suppress royalty. He took good care not to do this, judging that royalty was necessary and the royal family inviolable. But he arranged so that the kings were henceforth subordinate to the Senate in whatever concerned the government, and that they were no longer anything more than presidents of this assembly and the executors of its decrees. A century later, royalty was still farther weakened. The executive power was taken away and was entrusted to annual magistrates, who were called ephors. For 4 centuries, from Codrus to Solon, the Eupatridae governed the city, without there having been any striking political events. Their authority appeared legitimate throughout this entire period, when they were the only ones to know and to transmit the sacred unwritten formulas from father to son. The life of the city, properly speaking, declined because urban activity was incompatible with the patriarchal style of life of the Eupatridae, who, after their victory over royalty, all went back to living on their country estates, surrounded by servants. This was a kind of feudal system in view of the weakening of royal power. There were assemblies in the city only periodically for religious services. Society was steeped in the aristocratic spirit, as evidenced by the importance attached to noble birth. The praise heaped upon members of a noble family within the framework of epic poetry was quite identical to that expressed by African griots. Social Revolution. The Aristocratic Revolution modified the external form of government, but not the social structure. The political revolution had forestalled a social and domestic one. However, the latter was not slow in coming. The gens came apart as the right of primogeniture disappeared in the wake of the revolt of the younger branches in the cities. The clients peaceably broke away in the course of a long domestic struggle. At Heraclea, Cnidus, Istros, and Marseille, the younger branches took up arms to destroy at the same time the right of primogeniture and the paternal authority. True, we do not find in the history of any city mention made of a general insurrection among this class. If there were armed struggles, they were shut up and concealed within the circle of each family. For more than one generation there were on one side energetic efforts for independence and implacable repression on the other. There took place in each house a long and dramatic series of events, which it is impossible today to retrace. All that we can say is that the efforts of the lower classes were not without results. An invincible necessity obliged the masters, little by little, to relinquish some of their omnipotence. The client, who in some respects could be compared to the slave of the mother's household in Africa, finally disappeared in Athens. This was the result of the legislative work of Solon, who first took a trip to Egypt to draw inspiration from the laws of that country. Before him, a client might be sold to pay off a debt and could not own land because of the sacred boundaries which institutionalized the ritual ownership by the patron of the soil he cultivated. Solon, according to the time-honored expression, overturned the sacred boundaries, thus allowing poor peasants to become landowners. He forbade the bonding of oneself to pay off a debt. The creation of the tribunal for the defense of the plebes promoted its unity with the clientele, which then felt secure and freer to fight for its rights. Clientship became voluntary and contractual, as with the class of Navantines of Black Africa. Henceforth, there were only two classes. On the one hand, the owners who formed the ruling aristocracy; on the other, the landless of all sorts, comprising both the plebes and the former clientele. All the political and social contradictions being laid bare, a veritable class struggle, harsh and long, was to take place. Under the aristocracy, plebes and people had regretted the time of the kings, which they considered retrospectively as a golden age. At its outbreak, the struggle consisted in strengthening the royalty against the aristocracy. Then, from the 6th century on, the people began to take leaders belonging to the master class, lords, but without the sacrosanct character of royalty, who were called tyrants. As Fustel de Coulanges noted, this was an event of supreme importance to the extent that it consecrated, for the first time in ancient history, the obedience of man to man, and not that of man to a divinity through an individual. When the kings had been everywhere overthrown and the aristocracy had become supreme, the people did not content themselves with regretting the monarchy. They aspired to restore it under a new form. In Greece, during the 6th century, they succeeded generally in procuring leaders, not wishing to call them kings, because this title implied the idea of religious functions, and could only be borne by the sacerdotal families. They called them tyrants. The invention of money by the Lydians in the 6th century, the progress of commerce, and the new conditions of war allowed the plebes to grow rich and acquire importance. Money was not sacred. Anyone might own it, including plebeians, religious tradition not yet having had time to put its stamp upon it. Commerce was no longer forbidden to anyone either. It grew fantastically as Athens looked out toward the sea. Henceforth, the plebes entered the army and contributed men to the infantry and the navy. Naval operations became progressively more frequent, significant, and decisive than the former land battles, which were marked by the chivalry of the patricians, whose members alone were rich enough to afford the necessary armor. The state did not furnish it as it does today. The aristocracy, by definition, was idle. The manual workers, the artisans, were not, as in Black Africa, freemen belonging to caste, but slaves. As the plebes grew richer and entered into the towns, from which until then they had been excluded, they acquired a faith of their own by adopting foreign beliefs, Egyptian and Asiatic divinities, while gradually the aristocracy became pauperized. The plebes had its own bourgeoisie, its intellectuals, its politicians. Its tyrants now emerged from its own ranks and no longer from that of the Eupatridae. They became real tyrants of the people. The real concern of the plebes, as we can see, was not so much to build a regime radically different from that of the aristocracy which had oppressed them, but to become as much as possible like this class by setting up all the institutions and customs they had lacked to be comparable to it. There then took place a new phenomenon which resembles modern times. A veritable money class having been created, the plebes turned into a financial bourgeoisie, and the Eupatridae, like the nobles of the industrial age, married money in the person of a plebeian heiress. hence a witticism of the times. What is this man's lineage? He married money. When once the lower classes had gained these points, when they had among themselves rich men, soldiers, and priests, when they had gained all that gave man a sense of his own worth and strength, when in fine they had compelled the aristocracy to consider them of some account, it was impossible to keep them out of social and political life, and the city could be closed to them no longer. The entry of this inferior class into the city was a revolution, which from the 7th to the 5th century filled the history of Greece and Italy. The efforts of the people were everywhere successful, but not everywhere in the same manner, or by the same means. In some cases, the people, as long as they felt themselves to be strong, rose sword in hand and forced the gates of the city where they had been forbidden to live. Once masters, they either drove out the nobles and occupied their houses, or contented themselves with proclaiming an equality of rights. This is what happened at Syracuse, at Erythrae, and at Miletus. Solon's reform coincided with the triumph of the people. It was of a political and social nature. That of Cleisthenes was of a religious nature. Its purpose was to give a faith to all those who had none, merely by geographically splitting up the urban population. As against these two legislations, Draco's, which preceded Solon's by 30 years, was drawn up at a time when the Eupatridae had not yet been conquered. It was thus only a more or less precise codification of the interests of that class. But the poor class was not slow in reacting, and naming Pisistratus as dictator. Henceforth, the public interest would replace the old-time religion, universal suffrage would become the form of government, and Athenian democracy would undergo its effects. The unemployed sold their votes in broad daylight, and a series of laws was established, often confiscating the wealth of the rich. It was a kind of prefiguration of the time of the sharers. Democracy was to suffer from these political blunders to the benefit of the tyrants of the people. Movements of ideas. At that same time, philosophical ideas began to have an effect in the political arena. Then philosophy appeared and overthrew all the rules of the ancient polity. It was impossible to touch the opinions of men without also touching the fundamental principles of their government. Pythagoras, having a vague conception of the Supreme Being, disdained the local worships, and this was sufficient to cause him to reject the old modes of government and to attempt to found a new order of society. The ideas of Anaxagoras, of the sophists who followed those of Socrates, Plato, and Zeno, contributed powerfully to broadening governmental conceptions and to adapting them to current conditions. Rather than allowing them to follow a series of ossified ancestral formulas no longer meeting any need, Socrates contributed to freeing morals from religion, placing justice above law, and making conscience the guide of man. And this, without meaning to, he opposed the tradition of the city, resulting in the supreme penalty to him. Anaxagoras had the idea of a God whose principle is pure intelligence. It is he who governs our consciences. He therefore rejected the religious formalism of his time by avoiding assemblies as much as possible and refusing political duties. The sophists had great merit not in developing a precise and explicit political philosophy, but in disturbing tradition by questioning it and discussing it publicly. Taste for the dialectic, little by little, came into existence, and people acquired the habit of discussing everything instead of passively accepting ready-made formulas. But until Plato, even the boldest of Greek thinkers were not able to go beyond the concept of the city-state. At most, they tried to give this framework a new internal structure. Plato's Republic is a city. It seems that it was Zeno, with the Stoic school, who, having conceived the idea of a universal God, first spread the concept of a government which would bring all men together. We see from this how far ideas had advanced since the age of Socrates, who thought himself bound to adore, as far as he was able, the gods of the state. Even Plato did not plan any other government than that of a city. Zeno passed beyond these narrow limits of human associations. He disdained the divisions which the religions of ancient ages had established. As he believed in a God of the universe, so he had also the idea of a state into which the whole human race should enter. Higher ideas prompted men to form more extensive societies. They were attracted towards unity. The influence of Egypt. Without any doubt, these universalist ideas derived from the southern world, and in particular from Egypt. 1,000 years before the Greek thinkers Socrates, Plato, Zeno, etc., the Egyptians, with the reform of Amenophis IV, had clearly conceived the idea of a universal God responsible for creation, whom all men, without distinction, could adore. He was not the God of any particular tribe, nor of any city, or even any nation, but indeed the God of all humankind. These conceptions, which Christianity later adopted, were not originally a part of it, it seems. It first appeared as a Jewish sect, dependent on Judaism. It was only after St. Paul had been ill-received by the Jews that he turned toward the pagans to convert them. Christianity then became the religion of everyone, instead of being that of a given tribe chosen by God. If it was able to triumph over the other Eastern faiths, which coexisted with it in Rome, it was not by its moral superiority, but probably because its first adepts, having been distrusted and sometimes accused of political dissidence, St. Paul overtly opposed the cult of the emperor and predicted the end of temporal rule, were treated as martyrs. They were thrown to the wild beasts or beheaded. It was the moral benefit of this repression, which Christianity alone suffered, that contributed to assuring its triumph over the other faiths, which were liturgically better established and morally even more elevated. One cannot too strongly emphasize all that primitive Christianity borrowed from the cult of Isis in Rome. Even in the structure of its processions, Egypt is the country from which contemplative devotion penetrated into Europe. Concerning the religion of Isis and Osiris, the same author wrote, quote, "No religion had yet brought to men so formal a promise of immortality. This above all gave to the Alexandrian mysteries of Isis their power of attraction." End quote. We know that Christianity shortly made these conceptions of resurrection and immortality its own. These foreign religions, which made no distinctions among individuals, often allowed the disinherited of the plebs to worship. Here again, the broadening of religious consciousness manifestly came from the outside. The love of one's neighbor was a moral commonplace in the southern world. This notion could represent an advance in morals only in the individualistic northern Mediterranean. The Oriental worships, which began in the 6th century to overrun Greece and Italy, were eagerly received by the plebs. These were forms of worship which, like Buddhism, excluded no caste or people. The Roman Empire. Such then were the political and religious ideas which were to permit Rome, allowing for economic conditions to destroy the municipal regime and establish the empire. At the time of the Peloponnesian War, it had been seen that in all the cities the poor were partisans of Athens and the rich of Sparta. Depending on which faction was victorious in a given city, it became a vassal of Sparta or Athens. Ancient society thus was already divided into two clearly distinct classes, the haves and the have-nots. Their struggle had pushed urban nationalism into the background. It was this situation which in large part allowed the Roman city, so well equipped and enriched by commerce, to conquer the Mediterranean basin. According to Fustel de Coulanges, Rome was considered a city where a senate composed of rich patricians governed to the exclusion of the wretched, subjugated populace. This idea exerted a very strong influence on the ruling aristocracies of other Mediterranean cities, troubled by the class struggle. Therefore, at the time of the Roman conquest, many of them offered only a semblance of resistance. Many declared themselves open cities, and their senates purely and simply turned their cities over to Rome. Such was the course of events that led to the establishment of the Roman Empire. Municipal patriotism thus became weakened and died out in men's minds. Every man's opinion was more precious to him than his country, and the triumph of his faction became much dearer to him than the grandeur or glory of his city. At Ardea, the aristocracy and the plebs being at enmity, the plebs called the Volscians to their aid, and the aristocracy delivered the city to the Romans. End of chapter 2.